This podcast is for teachers and educators that want to better understand what racial equity is, get strategies on how to create a culturally responsive learning environment, and learn how racial equity improves outcomes for students, particularly students of color.
Morning, I'm Katia Turner, Zone 1 Resource Teacher, Elementary.
Good morning, I'm Lamanda Moore Rodriguez. I am Equity and Inclusion Resource Teacher for Zone 3.
Hello, I'm Shashray McCormack, Zone 2.
I'm Rachel Klein, Equity and Inclusion Resource Teacher for the middle schools.
Hello, everyone. My name is Avon Cook. I'm the high school resource teacher. So today we are looking at To Kill a Mockingbird, which is one of the core texts in Unit 1 of 9th grade ELA. We also know To Kill a Mockingbird is part of the traditional canon of literature. So although there are other choices on the Unit 1 curriculum framework, To Kill a Mockingbird has been widely taught for many generations at this point, and it's frequently looked upon as being a good text to introduce students to the idea of race and bias and prejudice. So we wanted to talk it through the R tool for NTI, the Affirming Racial Equity tool, specifically looking at the version made for NTI to address some of the issues. So today we are going to be falling in and out of a mock PLC so that we as a resource team can look at potential barriers for student success and how we can overcome them.
So we need to think about how To Kill a Mockingbird can be used in our classes, but we want to make sure that we are making sure that racial equity is at the core of what we're doing. So in terms of content integration, question asks, are you using examples from a variety of cultures and groups? I don't know. What do you think? Does this text do that?
The text definitely does not do that, and I don't see how students of color would be validated by the story that's being told.
I also don't think it would be all that affirming for white students, simply because you have only a handful of characters. The setting is rural. Many of the people in Macomb are living in poverty. And ultimately, you have kind of glimpses at white saviorism through the role of Atticus Finch. So I don't necessarily think that would be affirming for white students either.
Avon, I don't really understand white saviorism. I think Atticus Finch is a noble character. Can you tell me more?
So something that comes up a lot in the canon, thinking about classic texts, things that are considered traditional in English, are characters who on the surface are easy to view as noble or heroic or just. But when I say white savior, specifically talking about Atticus Finch, it's kind of this role that you can pick out if you know to look for it, of someone who is helping a non-white person, but the context of that help is kind of self-serving. So, for example, in To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch is representing Tom Robinson, working to clear Tom's name, but ultimately that is Atticus's role within the city already. He is an attorney. So him doing that is not necessarily a sign of his anti-racist ideals. It's simply him serving in the capacity that he always has within the city.
I'm not sure how comfortable I am bringing that up with students. Should we just toss the text?
Absolutely not. I think this is a good time for you to kind of maybe do a little more research on what it means to be a white savior. I do feel like that there are a lot of stereotypes in this text that kids need to be aware of. I do believe majority of the characters are white, and the characters are viewed from a white lens because the author is white. So not only is she speaking breath into Black characters, she's speaking it into them through her lens. So I think that it's very important that we disrupt what is happening within this text.
And I just want to piggyback on Shashray. If you're not sure what disrupt the text means, there's a whole website. So use your Googles.
So one of the things that I found linked to our NTI one-pager on the R tool. So the next section on the R tool is called knowledge construction.
My favorite section.
And I think that that is, from my reading, that's going to be important to helping us use this text in an equitable way. So some of the questions on here talk about recognizing and critiquing power relationships and helping students to realize that knowledge is socially constructed.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll be able to look at privilege and oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And if you click the knowledge construction link on the NTI one-pager, one of the resources that I found there was hashtag disrupt text.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the texts that they had listed was To Kill a Mockingbird. And so it really helped me look at some of the issues in this text from a different perspective.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I also think that the resources that are within that one pager will support us as teachers having really effective conversations with our learners, because within that link, there are supports for how do we structure essential questions to be able to get at these conversations? How do we set up the questions to be able to explore the differences rather than pretending everyone is the same, or discussing how dominant perspectives become powerful and group people as others and outsiders? It really feeds into those skills that are needed overall that set up a critical thinking lens. We're looking at it from a certain lens of racial equity.
So when I thought about this unit, I went to this website, and one of the links was a unit called Facing History from a group called Facing History, and it's a unit on To Kill a Mockingbird.
Mm-hmm.
And when I actually looked at our curriculum frameworks, this same unit is recommended by our CDLI team. So one of the things that I noticed in this unit is that they have some other texts that are related to the themes. And Kanita, what reminded me of that is that this also has some suggested essential questions for certain sections of the book that would help us get to those topics that we're less comfortable with. But it starts out, this unit, by focusing on identity and getting some paired texts in there so that we will have a variety of ethnicities represented, and that is one of the things that we were missing from content integration.
Yes, absolutely. And I think too, as we talk about pairing text, that's important to not only pair text, but also use texts that are text and stories that are relatable to kids now, to have the conversation about privilege and oppression, and to also have the uncomfortable conversations that teachers, because I feel like if you're not willing to have the uncomfortable conversations, that you have to do some research as to how to address them, like the N-word. The N-word is used a lot throughout this text. So if one of the parts of our knowledge construction is to, teachers helping students to understand how bias and culture influence knowledge, one of the descriptors talks about students being able to assess and discuss values and assumptions and word choices when found in the book. and one of the words is the N word. So, teacher, how are you going to be able to have the conversation around that word?
And I think Katia linked in there how to have that conversation. So if it's not in our NTI one page, we'll add that.
Yes, that was another resource that I found in this unit that relates to even the next section of the art tool,
prejudice elimination.
And so, are you intentionally planning lessons to build understanding and foster intergroup relations? And I definitely think that reading this book, we have to have a conversation with our students about the use of the N-word. And there's an article that's there that we could use to help front load what needs to happen in this unit.
So I'm afraid that some of my parents would be concerned, like if their kids come home and say that the N-word was said in class, like, do you think that I need to send a letter home to my parents? Or do I send them this resource about using the N-word? And I'm not sure where to turn.
And I know earlier, Avon had mentioned something about, before we're starting a lesson, make sure that we're sending home communication about what we're talking about. Avon, maybe you can say more about that.
At the start of the school year, if you are a high school ELA person, would definitely suggest sending home either a literacy letter or an independent reading letter. If you do independent reading, then you know that students will pick up all sorts of things over the course of the school year, and you yourself may not feel comfortable policing their choices, but parents and caregivers and guardians need to be made aware of the access that their student will have in your classroom. If you do not do independent reading, but you do teach whole class text, then a literacy letter informing guardians and parents what you're reading, maybe the nature of some of the books, is definitely a standard practice that should be done every single year, so that if you do come to a point in the school year where you're reading something that has made for an uncomfortable conversation or that has made for a classroom conversation that some parents may find unnerving, you can then follow that up with a phone call home or an email out to explain, and you're going to have something to reference back and say, we discussed this in August, but it's come up once again, and it's going to give you that credibility with your parents, but it's also going to let them feel seen and part of their child's learning.
And I'd say that ties in exactly to empowering classroom culture. So as we're thinking about teaching this book, the question is, are you recognizing the value of race and culture in relationship building with students and families? So maybe we could take that a step further, and keeping our communication with families ongoing about the kinds of topics that we're discussing, and perhaps even being able to give families a voice in similar situations that we're going to see come up in this text.
I think the text also aligns to a lot of really real world issues that we are dealing with now, because I think it's also important to bring in that that piece of helping students to develop inquiry, going back to the knowledge construction piece, as we talk about like power dynamics and power relationships, critiquing those within the text. Also spending some time talking about, there's a wonderful book out by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow that talks about the history of from Black codes to how prisons were created, and the pipeline to prison industrial complex that the education is definitely a part of. So it's a way to be able to bring in those conversations, even like for kids who are familiar with people like Meek Mill, his story of being in prison when Tom couldn't pay his fine, Meek Mill had someone that was in prison with him that was in prison for 2 years, and they had a $500 fine, and they were still in there because they couldn't pay it. So we're talking about the inequalities and the racial disparities that are happening even now. So there's a lot of things that we can align within this text to things that are happening real world, where students can start to develop this inquiry and analysis and this critical thinking around what it is that they're reading.
And Shashray, to your point, I think that's why this tool is so powerful, because we have long taught To Kill a Mockingbird in the schools, but we keep on teaching it the same way over and over again. And so we are missing out on opportunity to really engage this text with the relevance of our society and world today. We don't bring the two together necessarily the way that we should, but I think that some of the components of prejudice elimination and some of the components of content integration and knowledge construction really allow for that structure of being able to use this text effectively to be able to achieve those outcomes, to be able to have some real world conversations about how is this text like what we're seeing today, different than what we're seeing today.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the equitable pedagogy piece, right? Like, how are you able to take the other instructional methods and have a conversation, like the book The Hate You Give, like how can we use that text and this text and have these back and forth conversations, just like the two books are having conversations back and forth with one another, and helping kids to see how to use that in a critical in a critical thinking type of way.
Mm-hmm. And I don't mean for us to jump from one section of the art tool to another. I just think that also the tool is comprehensive, that you can't necessarily solely focus on one component of the art tool. You can't look at it as just because I'm doing equitable pedagogy and only equitable pedagogy that I'm achieving these other things that align with having an equitable lens to planning.
So speaking of equitable pedagogy, one of the things that I noticed is that this text is recommended for honors level. And I think that one of the things that we could talk about is how we can modify and provide scaffolds so that we can address those achievement gaps. One of the things that's happening to our Black and Brown students is that they're representing higher numbers in that ramp up level, and their access to high cognitive tasks kind of keeps them in that cycle. So I think that one of the things that I want to see us do as a PLC is think about what kind of scaffolds we can put in place so that we're able to offer this kind of high quality text with complex issues to all of our students.
Absolutely, I agree. And that brings me to even thinking about Audible Text, right? There are, not Audible, but, Audible, there are so many resources out there that teachers can use where, these various books can be read to their students that may have a little more struggle. Are we specifically just allowing our AP students or our honor students to be able to dig into this text, or are we allowing everyone to be able to dig into this text?
Well, and it brings about a question of the kind of cyclical nature. We know that Black children, minority populations aren't well represented in honors, AP, IB courses at the high school level. Generally, the demographics of those classes don't match up to the demographics of the school. So not only in thinking about the audience, but the intended audience, when you have less minority students in an honors classroom, ultimately you're going to have potentially less
Voice.
conversation, exactly, less voice around these topics. So in thinking of equitable pedagogy and how you could modify it so that it's taught to everyone, I think teaching it through that racial equity lens opens it up, because when you teach it and you're addressing, you mentioned earlier how Tom had to serve time because he couldn't pay his bail. That directly translates into our modern criminal justice system. So when we search for the resources to open it up and make it accessible, we're also making it more culturally relevant to a whole diverse collection of students.
Yeah, and I think it helps. One of the parts of the R tool, I think, is in equitable pedagogy, that talks about helping students acquire academic language and vocabulary.
That's the section.
So I think it's important that all students have access to that academic language, that academic language about oppression and privilege. And because when I thought about this, I thought about cognitive dissonance. So we're going to be talking about, if we're just focusing this particular text just on our AP and honor students, that's a type of cognitive dissonance there. When are we going to have conversations like the conversations on critical race theory? How do we have conversations with the idea of, because we're talking about some serious things in this book. We're talking about rape, right? And we're talking about a Black male and a white woman, and that's history. And here we're talking about Emmett Till. Are we going to talk about this, how the civil rights movement really came about because of what happened to Emmett Till? Are we going to talk about Birth of a Nation, right? That led to things like what happened with Emmett Till and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I think that kids who are not going to be in that space will miss out on all of the historical factors, all the social political lenses of what this book can do.
And if teachers have not done their research, and if teachers do not know the historical factors or implications, then it's going to be hard to relay that information to your students. So please make sure you are prepared before you have the conversation, so that you're able to guide students through that process. We don't want them to be any more traumatized than they were before reading this book. We have to make sure that we're taking care of our students' mental health also. So, and part of that is the teacher being prepared.
And then part of that is the teacher having that relationship first and foremost as well, because you have to create that space of, yes, a space of a learning environment, but also a space of recognizing what students' triggers are. And that goes also back to being able to communicate and have relationships with parents, and going back to what Avon suggested about sending a letter out or communicating with parents what is going to take place. And in that letter may say, maybe mention, is there something that you think may trigger your child reading this text, because it will deal with X, Y, and Z. These are the things that's going to be talking about.
And that brings us to another point. Do we want to make sure that we send that kind of poll out to parents? And we want to make sure we do that in enough time to consider using an alternate text, because we have gone through some of the steps that we need to take to teach To Kill a Mockingbird in an equitable way. And we have gathered some resources that are going to help us use diverse points of view, to choose some essential questions to guide student inquiry. And we've talked about some support so that we can do this across all levels. But when we're thinking about our classroom culture, we really need to focus on our kids. And the important thing for us to think about is this the text that we really need to use to reach our SMART goal? Just because it's part of the traditional canon doesn't mean that this is going to be the best choice for our students.
Right. And as we think about the traditional canon that the district is adopting, we have to even ask ourselves, what part does the district play in here? I'm going to, maybe shake the earth a little bit. Like, what part does the district play in this if the district is suggesting this particular text for teachers to read? Anybody want to say anything about that?
Shasharay, that's all I got for you. That's a fact. That's truth.
I mean, I'm just saying, right? I mean, we even have the book, The Hate You Give. So we're talking about the American Library Association has listed that as one of the most challenged books to read because it was considered pervasive, right? And it had profanity and offensive language. But yet we have this text from the canon, which was created by white males, and it has the N-word in it, which is offensive, right? So everybody has a part to play.
I think that one of the things that as a district we need to make clear is that teachers need to be using the Affirming Racial Equity tool as they're looking at their standard units.
Yeah.
I do appreciate that the CDLI team has put out there another unit from Facing History that would help contextualize To Kill a Mockingbird in a way that could be more equitable. But the ultimate goal has to be to center our teaching on our students. And so I think that we need to be clear in the message to teachers that when we're selecting materials, and we have broad freedom in JCPS to do that, that we have to put our students first.
And that shouldn't be a choice, right? I mean, we need to commit ourselves to this type of thinking. It shouldn't be optional to consider racial equity as we plan.
But to your point, Caddy, about how, again, the art tool can be such a powerful part of the planning practice. I think it's also a powerful part of just developing oneself as a professional, because there's language within the art tool that if the educator themselves does not have access to certain knowledge, they don't have understandings of certain concepts, the art tool asks for that to be reflected upon. So we were just talking about the empowering classroom culture section. Part of that is, are you affirming race as part of building relationships? Teachers can frequently speak to the fact that they're building relationships, but where there is a disconnect, where there is room to grow on, is how are we acknowledging and affirming race as part of building relationships? And there's a couple other components throughout the art tool that's asking the educator to reflect on themselves and their knowledge. Do they have understanding of, and I believe this is also within the, this is in an earlier section, but are you aware of what's inflammatory? Are you aware of what's empowering? Are you aware of what disenfranchises? And again, if you yourself don't have that as, if you don't have that knowledge as the professional, as the educator, then before you continue on with this, you have to educate yourself.
Exactly. And we're not saying that teachers should not be discussing these issues, because these are important issues for students to take up and understand the context of injustice and racism in our country and in our history. But when we take up a text like To Kill a Mockingbird and think about the perspectives that are presented there that do not center the voices that our students are coming from, that's a question. So if we get to the point where we decide as a PLC that even though we could take up this text in a more racially equitable way that we just feel like it's not best for our students. But then we're thinking, what could we teach instead? As Shashray likes to say, Google can be our best friend. And she's already mentioned The Hate You Give. There's a article, 10 books besides To Kill a Mockingbird that tackle racial injustice.
Yes.
So All American Boys by Jason Reynolds, Internment by Samira Ahmed. And there's even a hashtag to follow, hashtag Read Woke. So thinking about our students is going to be our most important guide when we're planning lessons to be racially equitable and to help us close those gaps in achievement.
Yes, and again too, going back to teachers making sure they do their research. You know, you have the documentary 13, which I think is amazing to be able to for teachers to be able to learn and pull from. So, and I think it's also for teachers to be able to be reflective on how they were educated and how they can be better for their students.
Yep. Because Shasha, that's what I was talking about when I was talking about the way that I read To Kill a Mockingbird was the way that my sister read it, was the way that my mom read. It's been the same way that we've been reading this text. We're having the same conversations. But again, we have to look at our outcomes. Are our outcomes stagnant? Are our outcomes relevant and reflective of what our kids need to do to be successful in this society, to be part of this society? If we know that we're in a ever increasing brown society, we want to be able to have our kids to be able to have an understanding of what that means. And of course, for the disconnects, for the areas of growth that a teacher does see in the art tool, if not Google, then of course we, the resource teachers, are always available as well to support and to educate, and especially as it concerns, well, how can I use this work during NTI? Well, that's why we adapted our article into a NTI version as well.
And I think, Kanita, that might be a really good culminating point here, where if the tool is daunting, if there's a question that you have about it, if you have a question about a text, don't shy away from it just because of your lack of knowledge. Turn to the resources that are there, ask us the questions that you need, and we'll guide you, we'll help you.
And so you all, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you being here with the DEP resource teachers. Before we go, we want to make mention that the resources that were mentioned throughout the podcast will be available via a different document. But some of the resources that were specifically mentioned during this podcast, To Kill a Mockingbird, there is a link to a unit in there that is disrupted for teachers to look at, that has all kind of essential questions teachers can use, paired text. We want to make sure that those essential questions or compelling questions are really getting at to the meat of what our students need to learn about themselves and the world. And then also Teaching Tolerance, of course, we mention all the time, has a wealth of resources. The critical practices are listed there. The Reading Diversity Light resources there for vetting your books and materials for your Tier 1 instruction. And then also just facing history and facing ourselves. That will be a really good place to start for teachers to start doing their research about history, reflecting on the past, and how things may not be so different from the past. So before you all go, we would like you to know that we have our hashtag RUJCPS to follow and tweet on Twitter. And again, if you need anything from the resource teachers, we are here to be a support. Please do not be afraid to reach out. We would love to collaborate with you. So thank you so much for your time.